I've been reluctant to do this for many years. Friends and family have asked me to tell them about the Moth Boy for years, but I've declined. Perhaps they think I just have a creepy anecdote or a fun factoid. Not a lot of people know I've been there since the beginning. For reasons that will become apparent, I've been motivated to look closer at my experience with this person. Moth Boy. A stupid nickname. Funny even, like a sidekick to an insectoid superhero. But I think we need to start at the very beginning. The year was 2004. I was part of an investigation, a missing babysitter at a foster home. It was peculiar, but not necessarily sinister. We'd had some calls about that home in the past, but it was mostly just kids being kids. Neighbours complaining about noise and the occasional broken window. This was different. The foster home sheltered 6 kids from troubled backgrounds. The parents had to leave town for a family emergency and had paid for a pair of babysitters to help in the meantime. These weren't just any babysitters either. They were friends of the family and well known to the children. Familiar faces. Let's call her Vicky. Vicky had arrived at the house Thursday afternoon. She was to stay there until Sunday, when the other sitter would come by. Vicky was there to help with cooking, cleaning, keeping an eye on the kids, and making sure the older ones got to school okay. But when the other sitter arrived on Sunday, she found Vicky's car still in the driveway, and the kids had been on their own since late Friday. We were immediately called in. This was not just about a missing person. There was a full home of kids involved. I have a background in child psychology. I was fresh out of college and had a penchant for westerns. I wanted to be the white hat who rode into town and cleared things up, being a shoulder to lean on and a hand to hold when the going gets tough. That wasn't quite my job description, but what we do and what we want to do are rarely the same thing. By the time I got to the Wheeler foster home, the place was packed with cars. The foster parents had come back just a couple of hours earlier, and it was full pandemonium inside. Some kids weren't emotionally ready to be interviewed yet, and others didn't know what was going on. Some of them had enjoyed being unsupervised. I could tell from one of the broken windows and the hockey puck on the driveway. Police were searching the area, interviewing neighbours, knocking on doors for witness testimonies, whatever they had to do to find this girl. But the key to the puzzle were the kids themselves. Someone must have seen something. It was clear that she'd been there, so where did she go? When? There were 3 boys and 3 girls. The oldest was 14. The youngest was 7. It was a nice place. A 2-story house with plenty of space. 2 rooms on the top floor for the kids, where they bunked up 3 by 3. A large living room on the bottom floor, with double glass doors leading to a backyard. There was a trampoline, and a deflated outdoor pool, waiting to be put away. A well-used ashtray on a white plastic garden table next to a grimy grill. Lighter fluid out in the open. There were 2 smaller television sets in 2 of the kids' rooms. An Xbox for the boys, a GameCube for the girls, both accompanied by well-worn and Cheeto-stained beanbags. It looked cozy, the kind of thing you'd have to pry a kid away from with bribes and promises. The place was a mess, but not a neglectful one. It was the kind of mess that shows life. As I was walking through the boys' room, I noticed a pitter-pat on the window. Looking a little closer, I saw moths. Not big ones, like the ones with eyes on the wings. No, these were smaller. 1, maybe 1.5 inch at most. You noticed them too? One of my colleagues, Officer Norton. Found a couple in every room, he continued. They're not native to the area. Probably snuck along in a suitcase. Or maybe they'd just attract that kind of attention. It was an unusual detail. Spongy moths, an invasive species. The Wheelers would probably have to get the exterminators. It was pretty serious. But invasive critters aside, there wasn't much to say for Vicky's disappearance. At least not at first glance. There was no sign of a struggle, and the kids had managed fine without her. They'd cleaned out the snack shelf and eaten 2 full boxes of ice cream sandwiches. But apart from a stomachache, they'd be fine. I would begin my interviews later that day. All under supervision, and with the foster parents in the next room, of course. I would try to build some rapport with the children, mentioning how I noticed their games and telling them of some of my own. I asked about their favourite shows, how they were doing in school, and what their favourite things to do around the house was. All little talking points to put things in perspective. It was all preliminary. Most of them were fine talking to me, happy even. There was this younger girl, Hayden, who blasted off into this long rant about her friends at school and the many things she wanted to do when she grew up. It's like she just needed an excuse, and she was off to the races. Others, like 7-year-old Brandon, found the whole thing unpleasant. He couldn't bring himself to speak. But after a couple of bribes and some time to warm up, he confided in me. "I think Herman did it," he said. "Herman's a weird one." Herman. That's the name people see in the papers, not Moth Boy. Herman. 10-year-old Herman was the newest member of the Wheeler foster home, having been there only half a year. The first time I saw him, he was sitting in the corner of the living room, lodged between a TV bench and a bookshelf. If you didn't know where to look, you'd barely notice him. He was quite large in stature for a kid his age. He had this sandy blonde hair with grey eyes. I could see them all the way across the room. He had this expression of a cat on the prowl with eyes wide open and pupils wide. He was just sitting there staring ahead, as another moth tapped on the window to my right. "Hey there, Herman," I said, walking up to him. "You mind talking to me for a bit?" I held out a hand and introduced myself. Herman shook it, and I felt this intense warmth. Then, movement, a twitch. I pulled back, only to see he'd put a caterpillar in my hand. The thing had these cactus-like spikes digging into my skin as it rolled back and forth. My hand flared up like I'd been stung by a wasp. I dropped the caterpillar and crushed it. Herman didn't seem to mind. His expression didn't change. I tried to have a conversation with him, but he didn't respond. It was only later that evening that I learned from one of the older girls that Herman didn't speak. Not just as in he spoke quietly. He never spoke at all. I asked his foster parents about it, and they mentioned him being an unusual case. "We don't know what happened before he came to us," they explained. They just found him. I don't know where my instincts come from, but I felt something. We weren't going to find Vicky with a thorough search or a surprise witness at the 11th hour. No, we had an answer in Herman. I don't know why, but something was telling me that behind those grey, doll-like eyes was an answer. I remember leaving the Wheeler home with a strange gut feeling. It was like an anxious stone in the pit of my stomach. Like I'd seen something awful. But my mind was playing catch-up with my eyes. I saw Herman in the window of the second floor looking my way, and even from a distance, I could see 3 moths fluttering around him. I waved goodbye, but he didn't wave back. I think it was Officer Norton who first characterized him as Moth Boy. He said something akin to, "We talked to every kid in there and got nothing." Well, not Moth Boy. We didn't talk to him. Herman was suspected to be the cause of the moth infestation in the Wheeler home. They'd begun to show up around the time of his arrival, and they were apparently very common around spaces where he spent the most time. Hence the Moth Boy moniker. It caught on. Even after one visit to the Wheeler home, I'd start to find larvae in my clothes, mostly my pockets. These little black, segmented things, waving their bodies back and forth like pool noodles. I dropped everything I wore into the dryer just to make sure I got them all, but I still had chills for the rest of the night, like I could feel them on my body. And looking at the swelling on my hand, I knew these things would be a problem if they made a foothold. Vicky was still missing. The search area was expanded, with a particular focus on the nearby interstate. The current working theory was that she was either coaxed out of the house and kidnapped, or left with someone willingly. There was no working theory as to what exactly would have made her do that. She had a boyfriend, but he was out looking for her just like everyone else. The next day, we took a more structured approach. I was part of a team of people who were interviewing the kids one by one in greater detail. I got the 3 boys, while one of my colleagues got the 3 girls. We tried to create a calming environment, using our most colourful rooms and a couple of toys and comics to make it all look a bit more friendly. First one I sat down with was 12-year-old Sal, Latin American kid with his head on a swivel. I could tell he didn't want to be there. His eyes kept rolling at me like a bobblehead. I asked him about Vicky, about when she went missing, what they did when they noticed she was gone, and he wasn't very receptive to the topic. We played games, he said. We had cold pizza and sandwiches. It wasn't until I mentioned the other boys that I saw a tinge of something uncertain in his face. He didn't have much to say about Brandon. More than that, he was cool, but talking about Herman was a whole other thing. Sal looked down when I mentioned him. He didn't roll his eyes or shrug the question off. "You have a good relationship with Herman?" I asked. "No," Sal said. "No one does." "Why do you say that?" "He's a freak." "What makes him a freak?" Sal leaned back and crossed his arms. And without looking up, he seemed to open a little. Sal had been with the Wheelers for 4 years. Ever since Herman showed up, things had changed. William, the father figure of the home, had started smoking. Julia, on the other hand, had started day drinking. "Not a lot," Sal clarified. "But you notice, it's the stress." Sal described Herman as creepy. He explained in detail how he'd notice Herman skulking around the house when people slept or when he thought no one was looking. Herman would never eat at the dinner table, instead packing his food into a Tupperware box and running away. "And the bugs," Sal said, shaking his head. "They're gross and they sting. I gotta vacuum my bed once a week. They changed mattress 3 times, but they keep coming back." Herman would never smile. He would never talk. "Have you seen anyone bully him?" I asked. "A lot of kids like that get bullied." "Once," Sal said. "I saw someone pushing him into a puddle, but they don't do that anymore." "Why not?" Sal shook his head, trying to find the words. "It was months ago. Herman hit him with a water balloon. There was blood in it. I wanted to ask, but I could tell there was more." Sal took a deep breath, looking up from the floor. He didn't want to talk anymore. At least not about Herman. Brandon had similar stories. Herman seemed to have no filter. They'd once seen him dangling a rattlesnake by the tail, playing with it. He would poke around little insect nests, hoping to attract venomous spiders. Even things like barbecue could be made creepy, as Herman would admire the sizzling meat, but not out of hunger. He just seemed to like the sound. One of few things that made him happy, it seemed. Very happy. "He spent 2 days with a branch once," Brandon said. "He took his shoelaces, wrapped them around it, and tugged. Like he was practicing." "Practicing what?" "Strangling things." Before my interview with Herman, I looked up a couple of things from his file. His original family had abandoned him and changed their names. He had been found wandering the highway by patrolmen, and efforts to find his biological parents failed. No one came to claim him. Even the name Herman was a temporary placeholder that kind of stuck around. It was no more valid than his Moth Boy nickname. Herman did go to school, but was part of a special education program. He seemed to pay attention in class, but they couldn't get him to perform any tests or measurements. He wouldn't play, and he wouldn't respond when spoken to. They knew he could read and write, but it was hard to say at what level. He would usually draw. There were those suggesting he was on the autistic spectrum, but he didn't seem to respond negatively to sudden or changing stimuli. In fact, he rarely responded to anything at all. So before my interview, I prepared some paper and crayons. If Herman didn't talk, maybe he would draw. Herman arrived with little fanfare. His foster father waited outside, having a cigarette. Herman sat down across from me, folded his hands, and looked at me from across the table. He paid no attention to the paper and crayons. Just as I was about to ask him a question, I noticed him rubbing his arms. "Are you cold?" I asked. He nodded. I fetched my jacket and wrapped it over him. He didn't smile, but he stopped moving. "Better?" Again he nodded. I sat down across from him and pushed the stack of papers closer, along with the box of crayons. Now that I'd made it apparent that it was okay to use them, he immediately picked the red and black crayons. "I'd like to ask about your babysitter, Vicky," I said. "Do you know anything about where she went?" Herman didn't acknowledge the question. Instead, he looked at the paper, then back up at me. He made a motion like he wanted something to drink, and then used a crayon to show a straw. It wasn't much, but at least he was communicating. I returned with a glass of lemonade, with a straw. Herman put the crayons down and sipped the straw, looking me straight in the eye with every gulp. Those grey, doll-like eyes. "When was the last time you saw Vicky?" I asked. "Do you remember what she was doing?" He nodded at me again, grabbing the black crayon. I thought he was about to draw something, but he wrote in all capital letters. "Very happy." "She was happy last time you saw her." He shook his head, pointing to himself. "You were happy the last time you saw her." He nodded, and added the word cooking to his paper. "So she was cooking." Herman nodded enthusiastically. "Then what happened?" He thought about it for a while. Then he added the words, "went home." Curious. I didn't get much else from Herman. But from what I'd learned, Vicky had been cooking something and then went home. Of course, Herman couldn't know that. Maybe he misinterpreted her leaving for her going home, giving some leniency to the working theory of her disappearing along the interstate. I thought a lot about it as I drove home that night. There was still no word about Vicky and her whereabouts, but I shared my findings with the investigators. There wasn't much to share. The children had been too preoccupied with their own antics and games to consider what had happened. They weren't mean about it, but they'd been too busy to notice her absence until she was already gone. Now that she was missing, they all expressed concern about it. The girls had put on this friendship bracelet that Vicky helped them make. Some of the officers involved with the case talked at length about the strange Moth Boy of the Wheeler house. Not only were there plenty of rumours surrounding him, but they kept talking about him as if he was somehow responsible. He was a creepy kid. Of course he had to be the source of trouble. That had to be it. "He's big for his age," one of the officers noted. "Wouldn't surprise me one bit. He ain't all there, that's for sure." I wanted to say something, but I didn't. I hadn't made up my mind yet. Coming home that night, I felt a strange warmth along my neck. The warmth turned to a searing heat, making me throw off my jacket, dropping it flat on my bathroom floor. I hadn't even closed the front door, and there they were, on the floor. Spongy moth larvae. Not just a couple, but dozens. Maybe hundreds. Shaking out the jacket, small balls of paper and chewed bread rolled out. Something Herman had rolled up and planted in the jacket lining. He'd poked a hole in the inner left pocket and dropped the balls in there, making them almost impossible to notice. That's why he asked for the jacket, not because he was cold, but because he wanted to plant these. I spent 2 hours steam cleaning the bathroom. Exhausted, I sat down on my toilet, only to spot 3 more larvae along the trim of the walls. I had scrubbed and steamed and scrubbed again, and yet there they were. Just a couple, but more than enough. It was long after 1 a.m. when I called it a night. I'd put the jacket into a plastic bag, taken it outside, and burned it. And as I lay down to sleep, I kept waking up, imagining the pitter-patter of wings along the glass of my bedroom window. The investigation continued for a couple of days. There was a lead about a woman looking like Vicky being caught on a camera at a gas station, but it turned out to be a false positive. Being back to square one, things started to look dim. I managed to get some time with the foster parents, asking them about their experiences and suspicions. Turns out, Herman was the most immediate problem for the couple to tackle. They talked about how he'd bring them endless stress, and the constant cleaning needed to handle the moths was exhausting. I have no idea where they're coming from, the foster mother sighed. It's not the clothes. They're washed 3 times a week. The kids aren't dirty, and they all shower daily, and yet every day something comes crawling out. The foster father had a different idea. He hides them, he said. Herman hides them. I'm telling you. We had a talk with the other babysitter. She ping-ponged between hysterical and cordial, making it hard to keep a coherent conversation. She painted this picture of Vicky as a promising young woman, someone making extra money to get a place of her own as she went to nursing school. Vicky seemed perfectly pleasant, and there was no reason for anyone to hurt her. Sadly, that just meant she was more likely to be a victim. The working theory was that her boyfriend had done something. Turns out he'd been lying about his whereabouts on Friday evening. Police were looking for him to bring him in for questioning, but he wasn't officially charged with any crimes. Yet. But there were signs that pointed in a very familiar direction. It was possible, but then someone would have noticed. Sure, the kids were all about games and staying up all night, but not Herman. He must have seen something. One late afternoon, I was writing up a summary for my supervisor. I had to wear some backup clothes, as the rest was in the dryer back home. I had this uncomfortable starchy shirt. It chafed in ways you don't expect it to. I was about to finish up for the day when I got a call on my office phone. I answered, introduced myself, and heard nothing. There was someone on the other end, but they didn't say anything. I was suddenly aware of my breathing, like I could feel the hot air brush against the receiver. "Is anyone there?" I asked. There was a huffing noise. I furrowed my brow and listened. I could hear voices in the background. Children. But there was something else. Paper? Herman? Is that you? 2 taps, a crayon against paper. Are you okay? Do you need something? 2 taps. Can you give the phone to an adult? We'll figure it out. 1 tap. Do you need help? Should we send someone? 2 taps. All right, someone's coming. Hang tight. 1 immediate tap. He didn't like that. Not that, I clarified. All right, you want me to come? 2 taps, clear as day. I drove out there with 2 other officers. I didn't mind racking up some overtime, but I could feel my skin itching at the thought of spending time with Moth Boy. It was like a Pavlovian response. I could feel something crawling across the hair on my arms, and I couldn't tell if it was the late summer breeze or something about to sting me. Just thinking about it put me on edge, making my legs shake like I'd had too much coffee. I arrived at the Wheeler house with a patrol vehicle. Officer Norton and his partner were my backup, staying a solid 5 steps behind with a practiced smile. The Wheelers were already up front. So was Herman, with a backpack. "I'm so sorry," said Mama Wheeler. "We didn't notice him calling until he hung up." "That's fine," I smiled. "I'm glad he feels comfortable talking to me." The foster father rolled his eyes. Perhaps that's where Sal learned it. "Did you want to talk, Herman?" "Is that it?" Herman shook his head, holding up a paper. He'd scribbled the word walk. "Walk the walk, not talk the talk," I said. "You want to go somewhere?" He nodded. The parents didn't seem to mind, but there was a definite worry on their faces. Perhaps they weren't used to Herman making a scene like this, or even communicating at all. I waved Herman over, but he shook his head. He knelt on the ground and dove in with his crayon. Seconds later, he showed me a muddy paper. The new word was rough, but clear. Alone. Officer Norton kept a smile up, but I could tell he didn't like it. Moth Boy was just a kid, but in some other way, he wasn't. Herman and I made our way on our own, following a trail leading past a bike road. We moved between houses, tracing a path that only a kid could figure out. A bird's-eye route straight through a busy residential area. Herman kept his head down with steely-eyed determination. "Do you have something to show me?" I asked, stepping over a white picket fence. Herman nodded, pointing straight ahead. "Is it about Vicky?" He nodded again. Perhaps he knew who'd taken her, or a clue as to where she went. The thought struck me that I might have to come face to face with whoever was responsible. I had my service weapon, but I hadn't considered that I might have to use it. Then again, Herman was a weird kid. Maybe he just wanted to show me a cool stick, or a treehouse. We finally made it to our destination, a 2-story house in a slightly nicer part of town. It was about a 20-minute walk, but it would have taken twice as long if we'd taken a less optimal path. Herman stopped and held up a hand, asking me to wait while he wrote something down. As he did, I looked over at the house. "Nice place," I said. "You know the owners?" Herman nodded, showing me his paper. It said, "Check pool." He underlined it and pointed to the side of the house. Something in his demeanor had shifted, but it was hard to tell what. He wasn't scared or angry, not happy either. But there was a new eagerness there, something urgent. I followed his direction, taking point. It looked like the owners were out. There were no cars in the driveway. Late summer vacation, perhaps. We followed the side of the house, opening into a big backyard. A large wooden deck with a scattering of folded sun chairs. Intricately detailed garden bushes, barely clinging to life, with an automated sprinkler. In the back, a gazebo, overlooking a pool covered with a tarp. It had this tacky corporate sunflower logo in a clear, sun-washed blue. There was a security camera facing the backyard. I had to take that into consideration. Maybe it had caught someone. I could tell something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. There was this cat across the yard that stared at us like it was about to attack. Perhaps it could feel the same tension that I did. But was it scared of me, or the infamous Moth Boy? I looked back at Herman. He nodded, pointing to the pool and poking at the tarp. I pulled it back. I was hit by this thick, acrid smell. Something so dense and instant that it felt like I'd swallowed a wad of charred hair. I reeled back, wheezing for air. The pool had been drained, leaving a hollow space of ceramic tiles. It almost looked like the water was still there, as the blue tint of the sunflower logo gave the light a watery twist. There was something at the deep end. Something black. I could hear a strange noise coming from it, but I couldn't tell what it was. A droning hiss, like a white noise machine. Buzzing. I moved to the side, looking down. I couldn't tell what it was, even now. Maybe I didn't want to understand. "What is this?" I asked. "How did you find it?" I looked up at Herman. He'd written 2 words. Vicky. Cooking. My heart sank through my stomach as I noticed the details. The curled fingers. Legs popped like overcooked sausages. And there, if you looked at just the right angle, a skull, locked in a mouth-wide scream. I could see the edge of her spine poking through her burnt clothes. I yelled at Herman to move away and made my way down the pool ladder. I had my phone in my hand before I realized what I was doing. I had to get back up. I had to get back up now. My thoughts raced as my poor excuse for shoes almost lost me my footing on the slippery tiles. I called out for Officer Norton, trying to tell him the address. I knew the street, but the number wasn't making sense to me. The only number I could think of was 4. The number of teeth I could see sticking out from the charred remains. "We have a body," I repeated. "We have a body. And I don't know if..." A trickle. Something wet. Rain? Couldn't be. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. Herman was standing at the edge of the pool. He was holding a bottle of lighter fluid. In his other hand, a Zippo lighter. The flame was lit. Even as I looked at him, he continued pouring. My eyes burned as the chemicals made their way up my nose. "Herman," I said. "What are you doing?" He dropped the bottle unceremoniously, reaching for his scrunched up paper. Still holding the lighter, he tapped a word. "Cooking." "Are you going to hurt me, Herman?" He nodded. "I didn't do anything to you," I said. "I thought we were friends." I tried to keep my words simple, but it felt wrong talking to him like that. This was no ordinary kid. You couldn't reason with him. He didn't listen the way others did, and he didn't care. Even looking at the charred remains of his babysitter, there was no visible reaction. He might as well have watched the clouds go by. "Herman," I said, "I need you to step back. Others are coming soon. I'm on the phone with them right now. This is very serious." But he didn't step back. He didn't put out his lighter. I could promise him a house swarming with police officers, and he wouldn't bat an eye. Because by the time they got there, he would have already won. I pulled out my gun. Never in 1,000 years had I thought I'd be pointing it at a kid, but I did. "Put it away now," I snapped. "Do it." The flame stayed lit, and he wasn't budging. He stretched his arm out, holding the lighter with 2 fingers like a dainty dame with a fine cup of tea. Safety was off. I could do it. One wrong pull of a muscle, and I'd be the man who shot a 10-year-old. "Last chance," I demanded. "Last chance, Herman." My legs were shaking. I could feel a cramp coming on as my muscles tensed up. My mouth was wide open, sucking in air like a funnel. He dropped the lighter. My mind split in 2. In one world, I shot Herman in the head. In the other, I dove to forward catch the lighter before it hit the ground. They were both valid options, but something in the world pushed me towards the second reality. Perhaps in some other place, the outcome would have been different. I missed the lighter, but it didn't matter. It landed with the top down, closing itself with a click. For a couple of seconds, I just lay there next to the charred remains. My world was nothing but chemicals and coal. I couldn't get my body to stop shaking. I'd been the flick of a lighter from going up in flames. I brushed away an insect, then another one. It didn't take me long to realize that Vicky was infested with them. And there, around her neck, something burned but unmistakable. Shoelaces. I climbed out of the pool. Herman was just sitting on a sun chair with his papers, writing. The cat had made its way across the yard and curled up by his feet. I didn't even realize I was still holding my gun. I figured I could still do it if I wanted to. One pop, and a lot of drama would be over. This wasn't just a kid. He was something else entirely. Something I'd only read about in solemn worst-case scenario profiles during training. Perhaps I'd be doing everyone a favor. Before I could say anything, Herman showed me another thing he'd written. Very happy. Of course he was. There were sirens in the distance, and he couldn't care less. You killed her. He nodded. Why? He thought about it for a second. He turned to his papers, making a few practice strokes. He gave the paper to me. A smiley face. No words this time. I escorted him to the front of the building to meet up with the officers. As we walked, I felt something. He was holding my hand. Not to plant a caterpillar in my palm, but because hands is what kids are supposed to do. They were supposed to hold people's hands when the going gets tough. That's what Moth Boy was working with. Assumptions. I think that's the first moment I saw him for what he truly was. A pretender. Until the moment those flashing lights came around the corner, I contemplated pulling the trigger, like I had some cosmic option to end lifetimes of pain. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The aftermath was awful. There was the fallout of the family being informed, but also the devastation of the Wheeler foster home. Not to mention the house where Vicky had been burned. Remember I mentioned Moth Boy having been bullied once? Yeah, the kid who did that. It was his family house. They had to move. They couldn't stay in a house where someone had been burned. And yes, she'd been alive. There was a security camera overlooking the backyard. Herman had tricked Vicky there, showing her some text on a piece of paper. As they got to the edge of the pool, he held up a necklace with a shiny rock. Vicky had clapped her hands excitedly and turned around for him to put it on. As she did, he switched the necklace for his shoelaces. Then he struck. He did some real damage in those first few seconds. Herman is larger than most kids his age, and Vicky was smaller than the average adult woman. After a short struggle, she stumbled into the empty pool, and Herman let her go. Using the lighter fluid from his foster father's grill and a Zippo lighter, the camera showed a sudden burst of light, and Herman just stood there, very happy. I didn't stay up to date with the court rulings that came after that. I heard he was locked away. I just wanted him out of my life. Thinking about him reminded me that I was the kind of person who'd shoot anyone to save myself. It put this stain on my mind, like I was the most selfish person in the world. I kept Herman's smiley face, paper as a reminder. I don't know why. Maybe to torture myself. For weeks after last seeing him, I would still get these incessant moths fluttering around my apartment. They would stay there for a couple years until I moved to a new apartment. I think it took 2 full years before I finally got rid of them. I'd hoped that would be a turning point, making me forget the Moth Boy once and for all. And I guess, for a while, it worked. But it wouldn't last. Because much like his namesake, Herman was impossible to truly get rid of. Like midnight pitter-patter against my bedroom window. The year was 2012, 8 years after my initial run-in with the infamous Moth Boy. After having almost been set on fire, I was eager to start a new chapter in my life. I went to therapy, I made advancements in my career, and I got married to a wonderful woman. We had our reception on a cruise. I know, unusual, but we've always had a thing for the ocean. We met on a diving course. I was living the married life, trying to get adjusted to the schedule of our 1-year-old daughter, when I got a call about a peculiar case. 3 men had died in the custody of the state. Prisoners. Now, prisoners get killed every day. That's a reality that most of us have sadly come to expect, but these 3 prisoners had died under unusual circumstances, and it all tied back to one recent change in order. The deaths started a couple of months prior, when Moth Boy was transferred to the prison. Of course, they didn't mention him as Moth Boy in the paperwork, but his name stood out like a scar on the page. Herman had been stuck in the system so long that he'd turned 18, and now he was a proper prisoner. In a real jail, alongside murderers, robbers, and God knows what else. I considered applying for reassignment, but I was specifically requested by name. They figured my experience with him might give a more balanced view of what was going on. Besides, there was another investigator working another angle. Let's just call her Mrs. Short. She was under the strict opinion that this was a matter of failed rehabilitation, and that the state was responsible for Moth Boy's behaviour, arguing that he'd just been a child when he was shuffled back into the dark corners of the juvenile detention system. That's what settled this for me. Not that I wanted answers, but that there was someone who wanted to put Moth Boy anywhere but in a maximum security prison. She wanted him in a mental hospital, and to receive care. I wasn't buying it. I'd seen that dead-eyed kid cover me with a bottle of lighter fluid, ready to burn me like a witch. I wasn't sure of much at that time and point in my career, but I knew for a fact that there was nothing good in that shell of a person. And if I had to argue my point, I was ready to do so. I set out on a Monday morning. I kept getting updates from my wife. Our daughter was a bit under the weather, and we were waiting for the pediatrician to get back to us. There was always something. Was she looking a little pale after eating that spoon of peanut butter? Was she breathing a little differently when she lay on this side as opposed to that side? I was always in this state of what-if flavoured worry. I arrived to meet Mrs. Short at the jail. A stern-looking woman in her early 40s with an evil stepmother kind of look. Not the kind of woman you'd expect to be arguing for nurture and care. We shook hands and introduced ourselves. She didn't seem all that pleased. "I'm sorry that they dragged you out here," she said. "I suspect this will be a fairly conclusive investigation." "How so?" I asked. "The warden isn't particularly well enthused about prisoner rehabilitation," she said. "Now, I know that isn't your priority either, however." "Excuse me?" We looked at one another for a moment as I blinked away 6 questions. I shook my head, clutching my hand in my pocket. "I've been working on rehab programs for close to 6 years," I clarified. "Youth rehabilitation, juvenile detention and development. A program I designed is used in 38 different locations. So I do care about rehabilitation. I care very much. Except, of course, for this particular case." "Yes, Mrs. Short," I said. "Yes. I think a 10-year-old who strangles and burns their babysitter is ill-equipped to return to society. He's not 10 years old anymore. That just makes him more dangerous." She accompanied me, reluctantly. We checked in our personal items at the front desk. Pretty much everything, but our shoes went into a box with a faded blue sunflower logo. I signed the sign-in sheet, and continued down the hall to a small office space we were supposed to share. Bare concrete floors, lined with white brick walls, the smell of chlorine and cheap soap, raised voices in the distance. It was impossible to tell if they were happy or angry, but I could make an educated guess. Mrs. Short and I stepped into the office. It looked like a refurbished interrogation room, and the lack of air conditioning confirmed it. Small barred windows overlooking a sniper tower, a single desk with 2 opposing chairs. Mrs. Short had already set up a laptop, and there were a couple of folders spread out. There was a TV in the corner, hooked up to show surveillance footage. "We don't know if he's responsible for all 3 deaths," she explained, showing me a folder. "There are signs, but there is no definite proof, no witnesses." I flipped through the folder, raising an eyebrow. One of the men had been found with a spongy moth caterpillar stuffed in his mouth. "You think the caterpillars showed up on their own?" I asked. "I'm just saying there is a presumption of innocence," she smiled. "We ought not to draw conclusions." Another man had been found with several caterpillars in his mouth. The last victim had been riddled with them. Then there was Moth Boy's file. Herman. He was just 18 years old, but had grown to a staggering 6 feet 8 inches. He still didn't speak a word, but had caused plenty of trouble over the years. Assault mostly, a couple of thefts, one attempted escape. He had the same dead eyes, and there was a strange musculature to him. He had these intense neck muscles that made it look like an old Batman costume. "His calling card in every death," I said. "Asphyxiation, asphyxiation, asphyxiation." "Strangulation, to be specific," Mrs. Short corrected. "Yes, they were murdered, but there is no definite proof of his involvement. The caterpillars are pretty much everywhere. Check the wall linings, you'll find some." "Was it always like that? Are you blaming an insect infestation on a single inmate?" "Yes," I said. "This can't be a coincidence." "Again, no proof," she said. "But yes, their arrival coincides with his." I was left to my own devices for most of the day. I juggled responding to text messages with checking surveillance footage. Moth Boy was huge. He'd grown out this shoulder-length hair that looked like he'd showered in olive oil. There were a couple of tapes showing confrontations between him and other inmates, and I figured that was a good place to start. Mrs. Short interviewed a couple of guards in the meantime. Moth Boy seemed to always be the target of something. Someone wanting to show that they're big and tough. Someone pushing him, or trying to cut in line. And every single time, it devolved into absolute chaos. Perhaps he was, or wasn't, responsible for 3 murders. But there were over 26 incident reports of violent behaviour in the past 8 months. He spent almost half his time in isolation, but it didn't seem to deter him. There was this one video of a man walking up to Moth Boy when he was playing checkers with another inmate. The man flipped the board. Moth Boy stood up, showed his hand in the man's mouth, and proceeded to try and pull his tongue out. It took 4 guards to subdue him, and the man was sent to the infirmary with a bruised tongue and a broken jaw. There were similar cases, someone trying to snatch his dessert only to get a fork shoved through his eardrum. Moth Boy had taken a couple of hits every now and then too. 3 stabbings, 2 broken fingers, 1 blow to the head that may have caused a concussion. Problem was, he never sought help. He would hide it until someone else reported it. By the end of the day, Mrs. Short came back with a stack of papers. She sat down across from me, organising a stack of papers into a new folder. You could say a lot about her, but she wasn't sloppy. "You see it yet?" she asked. "See what?" She rolled her eyes, but kept an honest smile. She pointed at one of the tapes, the one where he tried to pull a man's tongue out. "This one," she said. "You see it?" "Violent, yeah." "No," she said. "The checkers game. He was playing with someone, socializing." "I'm not buying it," I said, shaking my head. "Not one bit." "Then perhaps I ought to book you an interview with Mr. Doan tomorrow." I wasn't afraid to have my view challenged. From where I was standing, I saw a violent criminal protected by technicalities. If I wasn't ready to have my opinion challenged, it was worthless. So I agreed to see this mysterious Mr. Doan. Coming home that night, my daughter was fine. No fever, no anything. I took first watch that night, relieving my wife who'd been with her all day. There was little to no fussing, but I couldn't help but to think back on that 10-year-old boy, the silent little Herman, who wrote messages with crayons, the weird kid who'd been found walking along the highway. Are people like that born or created? Rocking my baby girl, I didn't know what answer I wanted. But if someone could be born evil, who was to say my girl wasn't? But if someone could be made evil, then that would mean they could be unmade, like Mrs. Short was suggesting. I didn't like it. I watched my daughter. Her eyes still had life in them. Joy, sadness, something. And I held her tight that night, hoping those eyes would never fade to a dead-eye stare, that she would never have to see moths as anything but creepy butterflies. I met with Mr. Doan the next day, a man in his early 70s. He was sentenced to life for the double homicide of his brother and wife. He'd been in jail for close to 40 years, and his life had slowed to a crawl. He was calm, collected, well-spoken, and had long since accepted his role. He was respected among the staff, helped out all the newbies, and was the one person none of the gangs looked twice at. And apparently, he was Moth Boy's friend. Doan sat across from me in the interrogation room. No chains or anything, there was no need. He was well-shaved and had a walnut tint to his dark eyes. There was an inherent sadness to his face, like his smile was being pulled into the ground. I introduced myself. We shook hands. I asked him about Herman. "They all call him Moth Boy," he said. "All of them, even the guards." "Do you call him that?" I asked. "I don't call him much of anything," Doan smiled. "I just wave him over. We play games, trade books, that sort of thing." "So you haven't been in a confrontation with him? No squabble, no pushing, nothing?" "No, nothing like that," he continued. "The guy's a gentle giant if you get to know him. Always shares his snacks. Did you know he loves music boxes?" "He does?" Yeah, Doan continued. "I got one playing that, Elvis song. Can't help falling in love. It's his favourite. You got any idea why?" Doan looked at me with a shrug and shook his head. His eyes drifted away for a moment as he crossed his arms. I think he just likes to spin the little crank. Or maybe it sounds funny. He's not a complicated guy. And he's not violent. Not to you. "Never," Doan reiterated. "Trust him with my life." Mrs. Short shared a couple of interviews with me. She'd transcribed them meticulously. It painted a broad picture of Moth Boy and his time in prison. The people she'd talked to spoke about him as an instigator, as if he loved to provoke. He'd slip maggots into people's food or stare at them from across the yard. He would never take the first step, but he would look for buttons to press. Anything to give him an excuse to defend himself in the most horrible way. But for some reason, this Doan guy flew completely under the radar. It had been months, and this was the only person not on Moth Boy's radar. It'd be one thing if it was a serial killer, some kind of kindred spirit. but Doan was just a nice old man with a violent past. Doesn't add up, I admitted. I don't know what to make of this. Then maybe that's something to consider, Mrs. Short added. I'm not saying he should walk free, but I'm saying maybe there's something that can be fixed. I wasn't convinced, but I couldn't refuse what I was seeing. There was something I was missing, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I talked to my wife about it, in broad strokes. She was microwaving a burrito and cooling her head with a bag of frozen peas while I fed the kid. Some people just have that one person they stick to, she said. Like how captive tigers can be raised with golden retrievers. People aren't like that, I said. I mean, this kid, I shook my head, imagining that grainy footage of him shoving his hand into a man's mouth. There'd been no sound, but my mind filled in the blanks. I shuddered. He's not normal, I continued. People can do bad and sick things, but still be people. But I don't know about this one. Maybe you gotta look a little closer, she said, shoveling half a burrito into her mouth. Hungry hippo vibes aside, she made a good point. When I put my girl to bed that night, I thought about Moth Boy again. His parents must have put him to bed at some point. Had they known back then what he would become? Was that why he was abandoned? And if push came to shove, could I do the same? Looking at my daughter, I knew I couldn't. No matter how dead those eyes turned, I couldn't look away. But something must have happened for him to be left like that. Or could he have killed them? He'd done it before. I put my girl down and backed out, only to hear her fuss and groan. I came back to check on her, seeing her wipe her tired little face with the full palm of her round hand, and a little maggot smeared across her face. Moths. I washed her off and changed every piece of fabric in her crib. I changed my clothes too, finding a handful more maggots. Spongy moth larvae, not old enough to be caterpillars yet. I was furious. If I'd ever considered his innocence, or an effort for rehabilitation, it went out the window in that moment. I didn't care. God, he was disgusting, and it just seeped into every life he touched. 2 days later, Mrs. Short and I were stopped at the door of the prison. There'd been a fourth victim, and an investigation was in full swing. This time, there was surveillance footage. We got to watch it while they put Moth Boy back into isolation, and we were not to enter the main prison floor. The footage was grainy, but just the right angle. It had happened right outside the showers. A man was walking back, meeting Moth Boy as they crossed paths. Suddenly, out of nowhere, they started fighting. Moth Boy threw the first punch. The man took a blow to the side of the head, wobbled, and collapsed. Hairman picked his head up, held it close against the wall, and kneed it. I'd never seen a head turn that shape before. The man was dead before his body could figure out what was going on. I could see blood pooling on the floor as Moth Boy wrote something on the wall. Very happy. Before the guards could pry him away, he stuffed something into the man's mouth. I didn't have to look close to see what it was. I knew. We all knew. It had only been hours, less than a day. But I knew that message meant something. I've seen that before, I said. He wrote it to me once. When? Mrs. Short asked. Why? Long ago. Not a lot of things make him happy, I said, pointing at the screen. Except that. Blood? Killing? I'm not sure, I said. Both. Neither. An uncomfortable thought crossed my mind. I turned to her, trying to find the right words. Does he know I'm here? I asked. Does he know about us? About our investigation? I think so, yeah, she said. I looked back at the screen as it flickered. Perhaps it was no accident that he chose those particular words. Perhaps he had something to say. Was he putting on a show? I talked to the warden. He wasn't enthused by my idea, but there was no better time to do this. An interview. Moth Boy was in solitary, chained to a bed. It was as secure as can be. The warden didn't think there'd be much to gain from an interview, but he humoured me. He'd been the one who called me there to begin with, after all. I was escorted through the prison. I could hear raised voices, and this time they were definitely angry. Some people had lost a friend, others a brother in arms. It was a matter of gang loyalty and demands for retribution. Moth Boy was in the crosshairs. Perhaps that's what he wanted. Targets. The more the merrier. More people for him to kill in self-defense. But chances were that he might be transferred to a different prison. This had crossed a line. Previous attempts had at least been subtle. I was taken to the solitary ward. It didn't look that different, except it had a green stripe across the walls. It was just 4 rooms, no windows, just beds, a toilet, and a sink to wash your hands. Well kept, but equally well used. The guard showed me a room in the far corner. He checked a slot in the door, slid the key in the lock, and clicked it open. He does anything he shouldn't. Get out. Don't take risks with this one, he said. We clear? I nodded. Herman, the Moth Boy. He was laying flat on a pillowless bed, chained and bound. They'd barely washed the blood off him. You could still see it on his legs. Even lying down, he was a giant. He looked my way, his eyes as dead and disinterested as ever. I sat down on the floor across from him as the door shut. He turned his head my way, not saying a word. 8 years later, and I could still see him as a little boy. If you didn't know him, you could mistake him for a man in his 30s. Life hadn't been kind to him. Hello, Herman, I said. It's been a while. He tapped his finger against the cuffs, twice. Tap, tap. A yes. Do you remember me? Tap, tap. Yes. It was an unnecessary question. I could tell he remembered. It was like looking at a dog who'd bit you. It knew what I tasted like. I tried asking a couple of control questions. Yes. He remembered the Wheeler foster home, where we'd met. He remembered the other children. And yes, he remembered Vicky, who he'd strangled and burned in a classmate's drained pool. And here he was, almost a decade later, still killing, just like I'd known he would. Did you kill this man for fun? I asked. One tap. Number that surprised me. Was he a threat to you? Number, did someone ask you to? No answer. His hand hovered over the cuff, uncertain. Finally, he tapped once. You wrote that you were very happy, I said. Did the killing make you happy? One tap. Was it me? I asked. Was it a message for me? And with that, a flicker of something in his eyes, like an old motor rumbling to life. 2 taps. Yes. Before I could ask him about it, I heard a commotion outside. The raised voices had grown louder. Someone was breaking something. The guard outside my door looked in, yelled something in a hurry and rushed off, leaving me locked in a room with the Moth Boy. It must have been serious. I got up to see what was going on, but the door was locked, and no one was coming to open. I couldn't see anything, just hear the angry voices in the distance. I looked back at Herman. His head was still turned my way. Is this you? I asked. Did you do something? 2 taps. He sat up as far as the constraints allowed, leaning a little against the wall. He was big, but he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Then he started to twist a little. Not contort or bend, just shimmy. And with his hands behind his back, I heard a strange noise. A light, metallic ping. The first tunes of a music box playing Can't Help Falling in Love. I banged on the door, hoping someone would open. The music played. Seconds later, it stopped with a clang. It was broken apart, and something clicked. The chains fell from Herman's hands. He'd taken a particular piece of Dohan's music box, one shaped in a way that could be used as a lockpick. He didn't hesitate to sit up and start working on the next lock, and the next. All the while, he looked at me, silently asking me if I was going to do something about it. I didn't have my service weapon. No one was opening the door, and by the time the last shackles fell from his feet, an alarm went off in the hallway. Something was happening outside, but the real crisis was happening in front of me. What was I supposed to do? Before long, he was free. He and I locked in a room, and he was holding a sharp piece of metal. "You want to hurt me?" I asked. "Is that it?" This time he snapped his fingers. 2 snaps. "Yes." "You're gonna kill me?" I held my breath. He didn't respond. Instead, he flicked away the little music box crank like the tail end of a cigarette. "You're gonna kill me, aren't you?" He shrugged at me and snapped his finger once, but he held his hand up to my face, his thumb ready for another snap. He could turn that no into a yes, but he didn't. He tried to push me, but I was faster. He followed up, swinging his arms out wide to grab me. I couldn't get away. He swept me up, turned me around, and threw me to the floor. Before I had a chance to react, I felt something tugging on my leg. He was taking my shoes. He untied my shoelaces and pulled them out, leaving my shoes on the floor. He twined them together into a makeshift rope and spun them around his hands. Something to strangle with, like he'd done as a kid. For a moment he just stood there, looking down at me. It was the same as all those years ago. Those dead eyes. He'd just killed a man. He wouldn't have any problems with killing another. He towered over me. I froze. Every option in my head was a dead end. It all came back to him. Maybe he regretted not killing me all those years ago. If he had, maybe he wouldn't be here. Maybe he was making up for lost time. There was something missing in him. This wasn't just a damaged kid who'd taken a wrong turn. There was something gone in those eyes. Something just as real as missing a hand or a foot. Something like a soul. He grabbed me. I tried to get out of his grip, but I couldn't. His fingers were like vices. I don't remember what I said. I swore and spat, writhing like an angry cat refusing a bath. But it was pointless. We were worlds apart. He could snap my neck without even trying. But he didn't. He didn't do anything. He just moved me out of the way, putting me on the bed. Then he turned his back on me, looking at the door. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. It didn't make sense. "What are you doing?" I asked. "What is this?" No answer. "Are you escaping? Am I a hostage?" He looked back at me and shrugged. He brought his thumb up to his mouth, and with his back turned, I heard a pop. Then, with a bloodied thumb, he drew a smiley face on the wall, same as he'd drawn with a crayon once. The angry voices had gathered outside the door by now. I could barely hear anything over the alarm, but I could make out the metallic rattling of keys. They were trying to get the door open. But when the door finally clicked, it wasn't guards on the other side. It was inmates. They thought he was unarmed. They saw the chains left on the floor, but they didn't see the shoelaces. Perhaps that's what gave them the courage to attack. When the first man swung at him, Moth Boy swept his neck up, spun him around, and kicked the door shut. He fell flat backwards, laying on the ground on his back with the other inmate on top of him. He used the bolted-down bed as a brace, pushing out his legs to put his whole weight into holding the door closed a little longer. He strangled a man to death in front of me. I heard the cartilage break and saw the muscles go limp. It was fast, almost clinical. Moth Boy didn't skip a beat, and now he had a shiv. He turned to me, and with a quick flick of the wrist, he stabbed me. I didn't even realize it until I saw the blood. It wasn't deep, but it hurt like a gunshot. A cut straight into the side of my rib. A surface-level cut, about 2 inches long. Then he turned his back on me like nothing had happened. The door burst in as angry inmates flooded the cell. One of them got the shiv straight to the jugular. They had these sharpened toothbrushes and razor blades, whatever they could get their hands on. One of them had some kind of flaying knife made from bottle caps. But the room was too small for them all to come at once, and one-on-one, they didn't stand a chance. Moth Boy didn't care about the occasional cut. He didn't even flinch. 3 men dropped dead to the floor, and by the time the others realized what was going on, it was too late. He followed them into the hall, leaving the door wide open. He'd wanted to hurt me, just like he said. But I'd clearly missed something. I shuffled into the hallway, stepping over bodies. Some of them were still moving, their nerves shutting down with every missed breath. I watched as one man lagged behind the others. Moth Boy got to him, and that would be the end of it. One strike to break a jaw, another to crack a neck. I held my wound shut, feeling the warmth pool out of me. And before he rounded a corner in the opposite direction, he looked back at me, a hand raised in a casual goodbye as his dead eyes turned to new horizons. The guards found me not long after, shoeless and bleeding. The whole ordeal had almost blown into a full prison riot. Apparently they'd found old Doan's body in the pantry with his neck cut. This, in combination with the previous death, had caused some sort of dispute. It had escalated to a pseudo-riot. I was stitched up and sent for debriefing. I had a long talk with the warden, but I was just waiting for Mrs. Short to show her face again. I knew she'd have something to say. She met me in the nurse's office before I was sent off to the hospital for a proper checkup. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed a bit frazzled. "He killed him," I said. "Killed the old man just to get the music box. And with that, he got out of his chains." "To do what?" she asked. "Protect you from rioters?" "Protect? No," I spat. "He stabbed me. We have witnesses seeing a man storm the room with that particular shiv," she continued. "You saying Herman did this? Just to stab you once and then stop?" "Yes, that's exactly it." And that's when I understood. Moth Boy had not just done this to mess with me. He'd done this to craft a narrative. That's all it was. It was one long story. He'd started killing months ago to show people what it looked like. Caterpillars showed into mouths. Everyone knew it was him. It was unspoken, but clear as day. Then he'd killed Doan, but without leaving his calling card. No caterpillars. That would make the whole block riot as they accused one another of killing the beloved regular. Some would blame Moth Boy, others would blame each other. Having killed 4 men, and always stuffing their mouths full of caterpillars, Moth Boy's calling card was obvious. He'd established it from day one. And those who suspected him would try to get to him as the rest of the cell block erupted into chaos. He'd taken the music box, possible even before he killed the man on the camera. Doan had been tucked away at the far end of the pantry, so people wouldn't notice him until the chefs showed up for dinner service, which was right around the time I stepped in for the interview. The guards had thrown Moth Boy into isolation without noticing the music box. It was small enough to fit into the palm of his hand. Breaking off the little crank, he could pick the lock off his shackles. He took my shoelaces to protect himself with a familiar weapon, but I can't imagine that's the only reason he wanted me there. And then he'd stabbed me, just a little. And now, as I looked at Mrs. Short, I could see why he did it. He'd made it look like I'd been attacked by another inmate, and he'd been the one to step in, like a guardian. And how good it looked. A gentle giant desperately breaking out of his chains to stand up for an old friend. "He was protecting you," she said. "I'm sure of it." "He didn't," I said. "He's using you. He's planning it. I've made my decision," she continued. "You're here in an advisory capacity, and I thank you for your time. You don't understand. He's the fucking devil. He was just playing with us. It was a playground, and now she was going to put him into recovery, within arm's reach of vulnerable people. She was going to put the most sadistic, manipulative thing I'd ever met into a program where he could get away with anything. And the more I protested, the more her mind was made up. It was already settled. "Please don't do this," I begged. "Please don't do this." "I'm sorry," she said. "You're too close to this. It's done." It was chaos out there. Screaming. Slamming doors. If I closed my eyes, I could smell the blood, and I didn't know if it was coming from me or the hallway. I'd later find out that, in total, 9 people died that day. My wife would see me at the hospital. I'd be okay. The wound looked bad, and it'd leave a nasty scar, but it wasn't going to take any years off my life. But as I held my wife and felt the thumping of blood press against my stitches, I couldn't help but think of what was about to happen. Mrs. Short was going to put Herman, the Moth Boy, into some sort of recovery program. He would lie and cheat and plot. He would use every tool at his disposal, and he would get her to do what he wanted. He didn't care how long it took, or how many people had to die. He just wanted to play his little games, and people would have to suffer for it. And maybe, at the end of the day, that was the point. Maybe he just wanted the suffering. That night, as I put my daughter to bed, I kept thinking about his dead, soulless eyes. I could feel something cold creeping up my spine as I imagined my baby girl looking up at me with that same expression, silently asking me if I'd still love her if she was a monster. And I have to be honest, at that point, I didn't know if I could. Maybe I too would have left my child along the highway and disappeared. But she didn't look at me like that. She smiled, cooling my soul like a healing balm. I couldn't accept a world where someone like her could become someone like him. I just couldn't. Some monsters have to be born. The year was 2018, 6 years after the prison riot that had Moth Boy sent to a forensic psychiatric hospital. My daughter had just turned 7 years old, and my life had settled into a comfortable yet unpredictable pattern. There was always something to keep an eye on, something to adapt to. A sudden illness, a change in schedule. My wife was working at a company that was about to go public on the stock market, and they were preparing to step into franchising. As a result, she had to travel a lot, leaving me as the sole caretaker back home. I didn't mind, but it was another change of pace. I hadn't expected to be contacted by Mrs. Short. I hadn't heard from her in years, and we'd gone our separate ways as professionals, agreeing to disagree on the proper actions to take. I had advised for Herman to rot in isolation at a maximum security prison, while she had settled him into a rehabilitation program. Now, those places are no walk in the park, especially at the level Moth Boy was settled, but it still kept that frustrating possibility of him someday walking free. Mrs. Short sent me an email. Names are omitted for reasons of privacy. It read, "Dear Mr. Redacted, I hope this email reaches you well. I write to you regarding the matter of Herman Redacted. After 6 years of improvement, the possibility of having him admitted to a more open facility has been put on the table. It is my professional opinion that this request be granted. The progress shown has been astounding, and with a more open floor facility, I think this particular patient can be given a proper chance of rehabilitation. I write to you because it is the opinion of the board that the patient be granted this opportunity by 3 separate, independent investigators. 2 have already begun their work, and you have been requested by name to perform the 3rd and conclusive statement. Your experience with the patient gives you a unique perspective that the board wishes to utilize. It is my hope that you will be able to set aside personal biases in order to perform this investigation to the best of your professional ability. But because of the nature of your relationship, you can discuss a possible reassignment with your supervisor. Consider this an optional opportunity. Best regards, Redacted. I personally believe you would be pleasantly surprised by the improvements shown. I had no intention of declining this opportunity. I would have a chance to keep Moth Boy behind lock and key for a little longer, and I was going to take it. Mrs. Short had gone over my head years ago to put him in this position, and I knew all the way back then that it was going to turn into a nightmare somehow. This was a man who had brutally murdered people based on nothing but whims and vague assumptions. Human life was insignificant to him, so I accepted. It was going to be a bit of a drive, but my neighbour had a daughter who would be willing to babysit for me. She'd done it before, so it wouldn't be much of a problem. She got along great with my daughter. I prepared myself with what little information I had readily available. The following Monday, I was on my way to see the infamous Moth Boy once again. Herman was about 24 years old by then. Nurses considered him a calming presence. Not a lot of patients dared stepping up to a 6'8" man with a penchant for violence. His hair had grown longer in the pictures, and I could see he was a bit skinnier. He probably wasn't eating or exercising as well as he had in prison. Notes spoke about his various improvements. Him joining a book circle, helping out in the gardens, and fostering a close friendship with some of the other violent offenders. It looked great on paper, but in the context of Moth Boy, it soured my gut. This was a man who always planned ahead, and who could let his ideas fester for years. Mrs. Short would have an uphill battle to fight, but I would try to be open-minded. I'd try, but it'd be a cold day in hell before I let that man out of his chains. A forensic psychiatric hospital has many similarities to a prison. It is a highly controlled environment, but the interior is made to provide comfort and a neutral tone. There's not supposed to be anything to set a patient off. Simple colours, inoffensive artwork, calm voices, and engaging activities. I had to get myself checked in, surrendering my service weapon, my shoes, my watch, my electronics, and my keys. I was also offered a white coat, something simple and bright. I hadn't been in a lab coat since college, so it felt a bit like coming home. I was escorted through the main hall by one of the orderlies. He excused himself as he went off to find Mrs. Short for me, leaving me alone for a couple of minutes. I noticed a man sitting by himself, a little further down the hall. He was in his early 50s, maybe late 40s. He had short salt and pepper hair and a wrinkled, troubled face far beyond his years. He was on the shorter side, somewhere around 5'2" to 5'3", and stared intently at a thin booklet. He looked up at me with a smile, shut the booklet, and got up from his chair. He was clearly one of the patients. He stopped a couple feet away, waved again, and spoke to me in a low tone. "Heya," he said. "You a new doctor?" "Just visiting," I said. "I won't be long. Consider me an observer." "Well, Mr. Observer, I'm Callahan. Let me know if you need anything." They had been told to avoid physical contact, something which Callahan seemed intently aware of. He kept his distance and made no attempt at a handshake. "What are you reading there?" I asked. "Oh, I can't read. It's just practice. Trying to fit the words with the pictures. That's got to be tough. A lot of people take that for granted. Words are crazy, crazy things," he said, shaking his head. "I mean, not crazy. Ill-aligned." He cocked his head a little, tapping the booklet against his head playfully. "My daughter has just started reading," I said. "It's difficult to step back and look at things with a fresh perspective. When you've been reading for as long as I have, you can't imagine life without it." "Yes," he exclaimed, pointing at me. "Exactly. Like, why does Apple have two identical symbols when they're just describing one thing? It's weird, right?" "Very weird," I nodded. "I bet she's smart. Real smart. Just like you." His smile froze as his eyes drifted, like he was looking into me, past me. And after a few seconds, his voice lowered, the words drifting out like a sigh. "I bet she's great." Mrs. Short joined me shortly after. The orderly assisted Callahan to a meeting. "They're having a book circle," Mrs. Short explained. "He can't read, but he likes to listen in. It's a stress management thing." "Isn't Moth Boy in that too? The files mentioned it." "It's just Herman now. We don't call him that anymore." She rolled her eyes a little at herself and offered up a surrendering shrug. "But yes," she admitted. "He's in the book circle. Callahan helps him with the printing." "Printing?" "Yes. Herman shares a couple of passages from books he's read in the library every now and then. We don't have copies for everyone, so he has Callahan print them up. The two of them are inseparable." I remembered the last person who'd been close to Herman. It had ended with a slit throat in the back of a pantry. But Mrs. Short already knew this, so I kept my mouth shut. I was taken to her office one floor up. My borrowed plastic shoes squeaked against the chlorine-smelling floor. Everything was controlled. No open sockets, no sharp corners, no locks on public doors or bathrooms. Fluorescent lights made the eggshell walls look pale. She unlocked the door to her office. Looking further down the hall, I could hear people speaking in unison. "Seems the book club was on the second floor. You're welcome to use this space," Mrs. Short said. "I've left a key in the reception for you. So this is all about evaluating your work then. That's all this is." She crossed her arms with a sigh. "Yes. You're here to evaluate the work I've done for 6 years. And I can't say I'm enthusiastic about my chances here." She picked up a folder from her desk and a USB drive. She handed them over reluctantly. 0 incidents, 0 complaints, 6 years. By far the most outstanding result we have. And yet, it all relies on... She waved a hand casually at me. As she sat down in her office chair, I noticed a sway to her, like she'd had a drink or slept too little. "You know where I stand on this," I said. Yes, I do. I'm painfully aware. Which is why I've been trying to put this off for months. Hoping they'd settle for someone else. Anyone else, really. So why didn't they? Why settle for someone they know is going to be biased? She pointed to the folder. Herman asked for you. I spent most of the day getting to know the facility. I checked out the gardens in the backyard where patients could care for their plants behind the safety of a tall wall and an armed guard. I didn't get a chance to see the book circle, but it was described as a stress management tool. Whenever a new or sudden change came about, the patients were called upon to participate in a group reading. Intense concentration on a single task seemed to help as a coping mechanism. There was a cafeteria-style room where they ate, collectively, with paper cutlery and disposable plates. Those who couldn't eat as a group were allowed to return to their chambers if there was no inherent safety issue to consider. There were isolation cells and temporary holding rooms, a small library, a recreation room, an art room, and a space for visiting family members to come by. My first interview with Herman was scheduled for that afternoon. It was to be the first of at least 3, with the possibility of a follow-up if necessary. I prepared my questions, my notes, and the interview space. I had to make sure I had quick access to the door, at least 2 nurses on standby, and nothing in the room that could immediately be used as a weapon. It was easier said than done. Moth Boy was clever, and if he wanted to hurt me, there'd be little that could stop him. As 3 p.m. rolled around, there was a knock on the door. There was a tall shadow on the other side of the frosted glass. The door opened. Herman didn't look that different from last time I'd seen him. Much like in the pictures, he was a bit thinner, but he was still every bit as tall. His hair had grown longer, almost reaching the length of his arm. But his eyes were still dead, and there wasn't a hint of emotion on his face. He ducked through the door, straightened out and glanced at me. I pointed at an armchair across the room. He had what looked like an iPad under his arm, probably a text-to-speech tool. He sat down and I joined him. I took a deep breath. I could see the 2 nurses waiting outside, both with pepper spray and tasers if need be. But Moth Boy, Herman, seemed different. After a couple of seconds, he tapped his screen. A mechanical voice with a British intonation spoke from the cheap speakers. I want to apologize. Is that why you requested me? I asked. I want fair judgment, he continued. You can provide that. I gave the words a couple of seconds to sink in, then nodded. Then you know, I'm not inclined to help you. I've seen what you can do when given the benefit of the doubt. Yes. I'm inclined to believe I'm here for some other purpose. Something nefarious. I understand. So what is different? What has happened in these past few years that has changed your perspective? He pondered the question for a bit, then tapped away at the screen. But this time, there was no voice. Instead, he showed a picture. It was an old turn-of-the-century leather-bound book, along with some simple hand-drawn illustrations. Fable-style animals dressed in the style of the Civil War era. Smoking pipes, cutting apple pies with a sable, riding horse-drawn carriages. Looking a little closer, I could see the title of the book, Adventures of Friendly Foxman and Minnie the Moth. I read aloud. Herman held his hand out, and I returned his pad. He tapped away. My earliest memory, it read. I remember now. You remember your childhood? Yes. If true, that would have been a breakthrough in and of itself. We knew little to nothing about Herman's early years. He'd been found wandering along the highway as a child, and no one had come to claim him. He wasn't missed. He didn't even have a name. I asked Herman a lot of questions about his family. He explained how he remembered a nice home by the river. He'd had a room on the 2nd floor, where he would read. His favourite book about the friendly foxman and Minnie the Moth, a family heirloom passed down through generations. Our first interview passed in a flash. Herman was much easier to communicate with now, despite the text-to-speech tablet. It surprised me. There were no tricks. He hadn't taken a thing from the room. He hadn't left anything. He'd just come in, done the interview, and walked out. But I had to consider that this was exactly the behaviour he would need to exhibit in order for me to agree to a lighter rehabilitation program. And he was manipulative. I was impressed, but not convinced. And I think he knew that. When I got home that night, I paid the babysitter and ended up spending hours on my laptop. My daughter fell asleep watching cartoons, so I had to carry her to bed. I ended up sitting on a chair in her room, scrolling past page after page of old American fables. I wanted to check this book out for myself, see if it explained something about his behaviour. I'd emailed Mrs. Short about it earlier, and just before midnight, I got a response. "We have a copy of it in the library," she wrote. "But it's a later edition, and some stories have been cut. We don't have the first edition. It's made by this obscure Danish-American author that mostly wrote about philosophy and pseudoscience. The author was E.A. Rask. It was a peculiar name, but easy to search for. But it didn't take me long to realise it would be a nightmare to sift through the overlapping information. It was like trying to read about a politician's taste in cheese. It's rarely noticed after a lifetime of public service. Likewise, E.A. Rask's children's books were rarely ever mentioned, even on dedicated sites. Not that there were a lot of them. They were his least known works. I returned a couple of days later. I met Callahan in the hallway. He asked me about my health and the health of my family. It sounded like small talk, but there was something about the way he said it that made me take a step back. But he was observant. I'll give him that. "Do you wear a watch?" he asked. "Usually, I mean." "I do, yes." "How do you know?" "You keep pulling on your coat. People who wear watches do that." I gave him a curious look, and he groaned apologetically. "I used to pick them. Steel. The mechanical ones with the click locks. It was easy money. Well, I hope you won't pick mine." No, that was a long time ago. Long time. When I get out, you'll see. Changed man walking." He held his head high. From the looks of it, he seemed to be a reformed man, pleasant enough to have a conversation with. But I had to remember that these people were in there for a reason. I was sure they'd gone through hardships of their own. But that didn't mean you can let your guard down. Callahan might well have trained to exploit lapses of judgment. Before my next interview with Herman, I had a run-in with Mrs. Short. She was visibly exhausted, having her third coffee and getting her fingers stuck in her tousled hair. She didn't pay me much attention, instead focusing on another email. Probably a last-ditch effort to throw me out of the process. We didn't exchange many words, but I brought up the curious children's book. "We got a copy in the library," she said. "He brings it to the book circle sometimes. It's harmless, really. You don't see some kind of connection between it and his fascination with moths. Of course, but the stories are harmless. It's just a clever fox and a mean moth. There's no subtext here. I'll have to see it anyway. It seems important to him." She looked up, scratching her nose. "So you're really looking into this? You're not just giving it a no and going home?" "I'm looking," I admitted. "I'm not convinced, but I'm looking." She pushed away her keyboard and leaned back with her coffee cradled between her hands. She took a deep breath, sucking in the smell. "If there's anything I can do, please let me know. This is important." I met Herman that afternoon again. He'd just returned from the garden, leaving him with dirty stains on his knees and little red spots on his hands from handling thorns. He was particularly fond of the white roses and the unusual blue sunflowers. "I tried to look into the book you mentioned," I said. "You said you had one of the original copies. A first edition?" "Yes," Herman wrote. "It was dear to me." "I've been trying to see if I can find one of the original copies," I said. "Perhaps that could make me understand you better." Something moved in his eyes, a slight frown. "No need," he wrote. "We have a copy." "Right, but I was told that wasn't an original. There might be stories missing." "It's fine. I think it's important that we consider." "It's fine." His shoulders rose and fell. He was having an emotional response. There was a tingle of something in his face, like a twitch waiting to take over, just under the surface of his skin. It made me think back on all the things I'd seen him do. I'd never seen him have an emotional reaction to anything, not even murder. I decided to call it early. Herman shook his head. "No," he wrote. "We're not done." "We're done," I insisted. "We'll talk tomorrow." "No." He stood up. As he did, his legs brushed the table, almost knocking it over. A couple of papers and a pen clattered to the floor as the two nurses hurried inside. Herman looked at them, then at me. "We'll talk tomorrow," I repeated. "I have important work to do." He looked at me with what I can only describe as anger. I'd touched a nerve. This was progress. Mrs. Short was eager to help me now that she saw that I could possibly be persuaded. I didn't know for a fact that this was the case, but I couldn't help but to be intrigued. This had to mean something. She asked the other investigators if they'd had any similar breakthroughs, or if they'd found anything about this curious book. One of the investigators responded. It was originally printed under a pseudonym. Emmett Olson. The author's mother's maiden name, I think. I know there was a copy by a collector, but it was locked into evidence after an arson incident. I had a lead. It was exciting to do some work, like back in the day when I'd been involved with the police. I still had a couple of contacts, and with just the right words, I might be able to get somewhere. I ended up spending the remaining day on my phone. The arson itself was easy to look up. There was a collector with dozens of books by this peculiar author locked up in evidence. Apparently the collector had tried to burn it all. One of his colleagues, a Dr. Bogan, had been the one to call the police. If she hadn't, the whole collection would have been reduced to ashes. Later that evening, I was on the phone with one of the officers responsible for the evidence lockup. The case had been cold for a couple of years now, but he couldn't just hand it out. "I'll talk to the chief," he said. "Maybe I can make a copy." And by morning, I had a .pdf of the first edition of Emmett Olson's The Friendly Foxman and Meanie the Moth. I sent out an email to the other investigators. They all wanted a copy to draw their own conclusions. I read through it as well. It was mostly harmless little, as things should be, kind of fables. Stories about helping each other, about being kind, about sharing. There was the Friendly Foxman, a clever but mischievous protagonist who didn't mind bending the truth for a perfect outcome. Then there was Meanie the Moth, a bitter dark-dwelling creature who was as mean as he was lonely. I didn't know what to make of it. Sure, Meanie the Moth was a clear antagonist, but there was nothing to explain how this related to Herman. Even at his worst, Meanie the Moth was at most bitter. He didn't hurt the other animals, not like Herman did. Later that afternoon, I had my third interview with Herman. He'd calmed down since we last spoke, but I could tell he had something to say. The moment he sat down in that armchair, he started typing. "Do you have it?" he asked. "I found it, yes." "Can I see it?" I'd printed a copy. It was just 60 pages, and the text was really big. It was intended for children, after all. I let him have a look. He turned to the last story, and for the first time, I saw Herman smile. There was a spark in his eye. After reading it, he got back to tapping on his screen. "This is my favourite," he wrote, pointing at the last story. It was just a cute story about a butterfly being mistaken for a moth, and Meanie was really disappointed at how much better it was treated by the other animals. The story ended with the friendly foxman telling him that if Meanie was as nice as the butterfly, the animals would like him too. "Can I borrow this?" he asked. "I want to read it to Callahan." "Sorry, no," I said, putting the copy away. "I'm not at liberty to give you anything." He accepted it begrudgingly. As our interview ended for the day, he got up and extended his hand. I know it was wrong to accept a handshake, but I figured he knew too. It was him showing that he was aware of taking a risk to be accepted, if only by me. I shook his hand as my heart skipped a beat. In another world, he would have thrown me to the floor and snapped my neck, but he didn't. I spent hours with that book. My daughter was curious about it too, and I let her read 2 of the early chapters before bedtime. She really liked the characters. Her favourite was Prudence the parrot, the friendly foxman's book-loving neighbour. Reading about the stories online, there was a bit of confusion. Apparently the stories differed from one version to another. Despite being published after the author's passing, the stories were vastly different from the first edition to the third. A few people who spoke about it online described stories that I hadn't seen. It made me think there might be yet another version. I couldn't make sense of it. Somehow these innocent tales of friendship, responsibility and common sense had affected Herman to the point where he'd adopted some kind of persona based on it. What was I missing? The next day, there was a bit of turmoil at the facility. I dropped off my belongings at the reception and was ushered into Mrs. Short's office on the 2nd floor. I could tell she was stressed, rifling through her items in a hurry. "Looking for something?" I asked. She shook her head, dismissing whatever she was doing. Her desk was a minefield of carefully crafted proposals and reports. "We got a missing patient," she said. "It's a bit of a mess right now." Come to think of it, I hadn't seen Callahan. He was usually there in the mornings. A knot turned in my stomach. "Callahan, right? How'd you know?" Callahan had been close to Herman. Now he was missing. It followed the same pattern as Dogan from the prison back in 2012. And Dogan had ended up with a slit throat in the back of a pantry. I could see why Mrs. Short was worried, and answered my question before I could ask it. "Yes, we've kept an eye on Herman," she said. "It's not him. Not this time." "You sure?" I asked. "You checked their common spaces?" "They're going through the garden right now," she said. "The others are up in the book circle trying to keep calm." She straightened her back and looked me in the eye. "I need you to talk to Herman. He speaks to you more than anyone. See if you can find something out." I agreed, conditionally. I refused to be alone with him. The nurses would have to stay in the room this time. People were running down the halls. Some of the patients were responding poorly to the heightened tension. Those who weren't huddled in the book circle upstairs were either stuck in their rooms or put in isolation. I could hear the squeaky plastic shoes pitter-patter up and down the corridors as pained voices rose and fell. It felt electric, like that moment before the prison riot. I knew it was all too good to be true. This had Moth Boy written all over it. Herman was already in the room by the time I got there. Mrs. Short had asked for him to be kept under strict supervision. He didn't seem to mind. The 2 nurses joined me in the room, standing on either side of the door. I got straight to the point. "I assume you know about our missing patient?" "Yes." "Are you the one responsible this time, Herman?" He shook his head. "You are?" "Well, That's a new one, I admitted. What did I do to make poor Callahan disappear? Herman didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at his hands. He took a deep breath and tapped at his screen again. Do you know which story is my favourite? The last one, I said. Like you told me the other day. Your last one, or my last one. What do you mean? He held out a hand, asking me to give him my copy of the book. I did. He held it up, showing me the final story and the many images. It's just like I remembered it. Now watch, he wrote. He closed the book, put his hands on it, and then opened it again. This time, when he held it up, the title was different. I took it from him, blinking at the page. New artwork, dialogue, an entirely different story. That is my favourite, he said. Very good. Meanie, the moth, and the magic lantern. The story followed Meanie the moth on his quest to find his family. He had found a magic lantern, but he couldn't light it. He invited all the friends of the forest to help him. But no matter how much they tried, they couldn't light it. Not Prudence the parrot, not Friendly Foxman. And as they left, one by one, Meanie was left alone once again. Of all the lamps that never shone, you are the meanest, and none shall contest it, Meanie proclaimed. And that was the trick. The lamp was mean, so it would take the meanest animal in the forest to light it. So the story showed the many ways Meanie did evil things over the years, how he teased and pushed the other animals. And when he was finally the meanest of them all, he lit the magic lantern. The story showed Meanie holding up the lit lantern, calling for the other moths to see it. And there, on the horizon, was the biggest moth he'd ever seen. The meanest, the coldest, the ugliest one of them all, and they would be the best of friends. And in the final panel, we see the Friendly Foxman looking up at the sky as a pair of wings blot out the sun. The story ended on an eerie portrait of wide-open eyes, being consumed by the dark. My hands were shaking. I looked up at one of the nurses and handed them the book. Check the last story, I said. Check it. They flipped the pages, then showed me. It was another story now. Friendly Foxman and the Curious Caterpillar. I handed it to the next nurse, then looked back at Herman. That's impossible, I said. How do you do that? I'm very mean, he wrote. The meanest in the forest. Books couldn't change. We read books, they don't read us. But no matter the source of the trick, that story showed something about Herman. Something he hadn't shown us before. You're going to light a lantern, like in the story. A magic lantern. Yes? I don't see you doing that anytime soon, Herman. I see you being locked in here for a long time. He nodded, then tapped the screen again. Too late. The nurses put away the book and took a step forward. In an explosion of movement, Herman flipped the table at them. One of them fell backward, taking the full brunt of the force on their right wrist. Herman reached across the flipped table, grabbing the other nurse and pulling him across like a wet towel. His shot went wild. I fumbled to the floor, taking the other taser from the nurse with the sprained wrist. I called out for him to go get help, and they scrambled out the door. By the time I looked up, Herman was beating the other nurse within an inch of his life, reducing half of the man's face to meat. I raised the taser, coming face to face with Herman, who opened his mouth in response. He spat at me. A spatter of paper tissue, larvae, and stinging caterpillars showered me. One of the caterpillars stung the corner of my eye, causing a painful burn to trickle up the side of my face. All these years, his mouth had just been another weapon. This was how the moths kept popping up around him. He'd turned his body into a nest. This was why he didn't speak. why he refused to eat in the common hall. He was honing a last-ditch weapon. He was spitting his namesake in my face to win another fight. I was completely off balance, and by the time I opened my eyes, he had one hand to my throat and one hand on the taser. His mouth was wide open, showing a tapestry of scars, paper, and blood. Most of his teeth were black or missing. His tongue was as white as the larvae he hosted. He took me in a chokehold and pulled me into the hallway. Something had happened. People were screaming and throwing things. I could see other nurses and caretakers running in the halls, heading for the exit. But Herman was taking me in the other direction, to the book circle. The thought hit me that I hadn't seen Mrs. Short's copy of the book on her desk. I hadn't seen Callahan either. And I knew for a fact that whenever something happened, the book circle was supposed to read something to calm themselves down. I tried to twist and turn, but I could feel a pressure on my neck that made me gasp for air. If he jerked me up, he could snap my neck. So step by step, I tried my best to just breathe. We entered the small library at the end of the corridor. 9 men sat in a circle, each with a copy of Adventures of Friendly Foxman and Meanie the Moth. Callahan must have stolen it, copied it, and distributed it. Herman knew that when all went to hell, they'd be right there, reading from today's stories. But listening to them, it didn't sound like someone reading a story at all. It was just noise. The story had changed. There were no pictures. There were no words, only symbols, some bearing faint resemblance to the Roman alphabet. And yet, they read it in unison with perfect pronunciation. They'd been trained to do this, as a group, for years. This was it. This was what he'd planned. He'd failed that first time, with Vicky the babysitter. He'd set her on fire as an attempt to light the magic lantern, the symbol of calling to something greater. But he'd failed. Perhaps, like in the story, he wasn't the meanest creature in the forest. Not yet. But now it was different. He'd dedicated his life to manipulating, to wounding, to harming others in ways that would kill them or haunt them. And this time, he was asking all the creatures of his forest to help him, just like in the story. But in the end, it would be him doing it, and I'd given him the book to finish it. Maybe he knew there was a copy left in an evidence lockup. Maybe that's why he asked for me to begin with. He knew I could get to it. The chanted words were nonsense, but at the end of the story, there was a sound I'll never forget. In unison, they coughed out, "El! El! El!" Herman took out a single matchstick from the back of his mouth. He dropped it in the middle of the book circle. Then he joined the others. And with his own voice, for the first time, he wheezed a word out. "El!" The matchstick caught fire. A flame spread to the 9 men in a spiraling pattern, casting fluttering shadows across the walls. The smell brought me back all the way to 2002, lying next to a smouldering corpse on the bottom of an empty pool. The men didn't scream. It was as if they were dead already. I couldn't comprehend what kind of story the book had shown them. I pulled at Herman's arm as the flames reached us. He didn't let go. I stomped, trying to buy some time. "Let me go," I wheezed. "You don't need me. You're done." He blinked, then looked at me. There was something in his face that I hadn't seen. Perhaps he'd faked emotion to trick me into pursuing that book. It made sense. Pretending to be upset would just motivate me. But now, his emotions were real. A full, open-mouthed smile, as lava dripped from his lip. "It's done," I repeated. "Just stop." He was so full of joy. The flames danced in his eyes as the alarms began to scream. There were sirens approaching outside, and with that, he let me go. Dank Hugh, he muttered, his voice strained. Dank Hugh Evie Mush. I backed away as the flames grabbed him. He didn't look away. The smoke from the library tickled my lungs, and I burst into a sprint down the hallway. The nurse he'd beaten had been dragged out. There were trails of blood on the floor. I followed it, hoping it would lead me outside. Everything looks different in a panic. In the smoke. I made it outside, and into pandemonium. The air was so full of moths, it could be mistaken for a mist. They'd come from the gardens, ushered into the air by the sudden fire. People were screaming, waving their arms, locking themselves in their cars. Police and firefighters were struggling to make it to the front, almost running over an orderly as they struggled to see. Mrs. Short was locked in her car in the parking lot, staring straight ahead with tear-stained eyes. We exchanged a glance as she shook her head, defeated. It was over. All her work and hopes gone. I couldn't take my car home. I had left my keys in the reception, and I couldn't get them back until they had the fire under control. That would be hours. I ended up getting an escort from a police officer about an hour later. He was picking larvae from his uniform the whole ride, complaining about how he'd have to go through every inch of that car with a hose when this was over. The last thing I saw of the facility was a plume of smoke blotting out the sun, like a pair of dark, dusty wings. I was dropped off at home. I walked up to my door and sighed. I didn't have my keys, so it'd be locked. My daughter and the babysitter was home though, so it ought to be fine. But the door was open. It shouldn't be. I poked the door open, listening. There was no one there. I could hear voices from upstairs. I looked into the kitchen for something to arm myself with. I didn't have my phone, and the officer who'd dropped me off was far gone by now. I reached for my knife block, only to realize one of the knives was already gone. I settled for a smaller one. My hand rattled so bad I almost dropped it. I forced my fingers to close into a cramp-like death grip. I crept up the stairs, holding my breath. I knew where to put my feet to avoid a creaking. So, he said, "Birthdays? You still have those? And guess what? Guess what I said?" The voice was familiar, but unstable. Shaking. Callahan. I opened my daughter's bedroom door. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a kitchen knife. He was looking at the closet across the room. It had been cut and beaten, but was held close. I could hear sniffling from the inside. He said, "You can't have birthdays when you're old," Callahan rambled on. "But that's stupid, right? Of course you can." I tightened my grip on the knife. I could lunge at him, put it in his back. But something told me not to. Perhaps the tales of friendly foxmen had affected me more than I thought. "Callahan," I said. "What are you doing here?" He turned to me in wild surprise. But instead of lunging at me, he smiled from ear to ear. He got up, seemingly forgetting that he was holding a knife. "Hey," he said. "I was just having a conversation with your lovely daughter." "I need you to stop it, Callahan. But you said she was great. I thought we'd get along." "You're scaring them." His smile faded as he looked down at his knife. He looked at the closet door, covered in cuts and bruises. He shook his head, as if just realizing what was going on. "I'm scaring them?" "Yes." Herman said it was okay. "It's not," I said. "Now drop the knife." He did. I thought back on that moment in 2002 where I'd pointed my gun at 10-year-old Herman. I hadn't pulled the trigger, and all the consequences that came after that decision could be traced back to me. Every prison murder, every twisted word and half-truth. Now I had a choice again, and I couldn't make my mind up. "I'm sorry," said Callahan. "I thought it was okay." And just like I'd done all those years ago, I let go. I took him downstairs. I hugged my daughter and had the babysitter call the police. It didn't take them long to come by and take Callahan into custody. They had him moved to a temporary facility waiting for reassignment. He looked completely destroyed when they put him in the squad car. No screaming or fighting, just a quiet sobbing. It was long after midnight when the final car left my property. I sat by my daughter as she fell asleep. I went outside, sat down on the top of the stairs, and had a long talk with my wife. She called off her business trip and took the first flight home in the morning. When all was said and done, I looked at the forest across the yard, the swaying trees, singing along with the evening wind. Perhaps I was the same person now as I'd been back then. Despite the innumerable horrors and twisted words, maybe I was still the person who couldn't pull the trigger if push came to shove. But was it because I was a coward? Or because I believed in people? Did it matter? As I got up to head to bed, I noticed something on the driveway. Something metallic. It was my things from the reception. My service weapon, my wallet, my keys. They were a bit ashen, but they were mine. Nothing was missing. I looked up. I called out, but there was no one there. Just the flutter of something small by the tree line. Herman could have killed me back in the library. He held me, waiting for the flames. But he'd had no reason to be mean anymore. His magic lantern was lit. And perhaps that was all he really cared for. Maybe that's why he let me go. Looking back at this, I think I know what kind of man I want to be. I want to be the one who can imagine a light in anyone's darkness. In Mrs. Short, in Callahan, and perhaps in a Moth Boy. They never found his body. The facility never got rid of the moths. Some claim that they saw Herman leaving in the company of a man. Others said they saw him burned to death in that library. And some claim to have seen him, years later, out and about as a free man. He was easy to spot in a crowd. Personally, I haven't seen or heard from him since, but every now and then, I hear the flutter of a moth and I look to the sky. And if I look really hard, I can almost see two dusty wings, blotting out the sun. Hi everyone, thanks for listening. I personally thought that was an amazing story. It was written by Reddit's own Saturdead. I'd love to know what you guys think of it down in the comments, so if you've got a sec, let me know. Listen, when I was recording the second part of this series, I swear to you, I walked into my room and there were two moths circling around the lamp. Two. I've never been so freaked out in my life. I just stood there like, nope, absolutely not. This is how I die. I mean, all of the bugs that could have shown up, it had to be moths, right? It felt like Moth Boy himself had sent him down to check on me. So yeah, safe to say, narrating this one hit a little too close to home. Anyway, if you enjoyed this story, please like, comment and subscribe. It really helps push the channel out there. And until next time, maybe keep an eye on your lamp. You never know what might show up. Oh, do you want a fun fact? No. Okay, I'll tell you anyway. Did you know some moths don't even have mouths? They hatch, fly around, mate, and die, all without ever eating. Honestly, if I were a moth, I'd be furious. At least let me have some pizza first, right? Good night.